Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of the Listening Room Sonic Journeys. I'm your host, your groove guru, and your guide to the vibes, the cultural DJ. First off, I want to say it is getting hotter and there's a lot of pollen in the air, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm currently afflicted by allergies, so if I sound kind of funny or have to clear my throat a bit, I do apologize in advance. I also would like to say, before I start the episode proper, is that Cultural DJ is celebrating its 1-year anniversary this week. I started Cultural DJ roughly about a year ago, and it's grown exponentially. It's grown to a place where I'm really proud of what I'm seeing with it, and I look forward to continue to seeing it grow. It's really amazing. I love doing everything that I do with Cultural DJ, including this podcast. So, I just wanted to throw that out there. I'm very happy. I'm very proud of what Cultural DJ has not only become, but what it is going to become in the future as the months and years go by. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe. There's new episodes every Thursday, and there's also an accompanying playlist as well with tracks curated by yours truly. So with all that out of the way, let's get right into the topic, which is Afrofuturism. More specifically, we are analyzing two of the biggest pioneers in Afrofuturism, that being Sun Ra and George Clinton. But for those that are uninitiated, what exactly is Afrofuturism? Well, it's a handful of things. Really, it's kind of like a cultural aesthetic, and it's heavily based around science fiction, and it crosses science fiction with African diaspora, with futuristic science and technology. It also includes a lot of ancestral spiritualism, fantasy, magic. So it's a lot of things kind of melded into one, but it's mostly based around science fiction and the African or African American experience, really. As far as the philosophy surrounding it, it's kind of like a hypothetical expansion of Black culture that integrates technology of the distant future. It idealizes the direction that Black people can go in, and it's heavily centered around cultural advancement. And it's been portrayed in a lot of different mediums, including different works of fiction, art, film, and in this case, music. The term itself was coined by the cultural critic Mark Derry, who said it's basically speculative fiction that treats African American themes and addresses African American concerns in the context of 20th century technoculture and more generally African American signification that appropriates images of technology and a prosthetically enhanced future. Might, for want of a better term, be called Afrofuturism. That was a direct quote from him, a direct quote from his 1993 essay called Black to the Future. It was further expanded upon by author Alondra Nelson, especially in her special issue of Social Text from 2002 called Afrofuturism, and also Yatasha L. Womack, who's a writer of Afrofuturism, the world of Black sci-fi and fantasy culture. She said Afrofuturism is an intersection of imagination, technology, the future, and liberation. And then you also have the curator Ingrid Lafleur, who said a way of imagining possible futures through a Black cultural lens. So those are different pulls from the people who kind of gave Afrofuturism its definition more properly. Because, Afrofuturism as a whole has been around for a while. We're about to get into that. But it was around, actually, the 90s and, the early 2000s where Afrofuturism was better defined by critics, by writers, authors, etc., who were interested in the subject and further explored a lot of the facets of Afrofuturism and wrote it down so that we could better understand kind of the ideas, the ideology behind Afrofuturism, which was mostly, before then, more of something that was understood more in a more communal sense, so to speak. So the term was coined well past the artistic activity's genesis. It didn't have a definitive name until 1993, and this is kind of interesting because the works we're going to be discussing date as far back as the 1950s. That does not make it an underground or obscure concept, though. It was utilized very, very frequently throughout the late 20th century and as well as the 21st century in both art and music. And even those who weren't closely associated with the movement still adopted many elements of the movement itself. So now we'll get into our first pioneer, that being one Mr. Sun Ra. Sun Ra was born Herman Poole Blount on May 21st, 1914 in Birmingham, Alabama. He moved to Chicago in the 1940s and got himself involved in the jazz scene. He's a pianist, keyboard player. And it was then around the 40s that he changed his name from Herman Poole Blount to Lesonier Ra, or shortening it more to Sun Ra after the Egyptian god Ra. And Sun Ra is not only an early proponent of Afrofuturism, but arguably the most early proponent, the most early pioneer of Afrofuturism. And this is found in his music, the way he dressed, his stage performance, and his philosophy. Everything we're going to get into in just a second. Starting off with his music. Now, Sun Ra is this is a huge understatement, but Sun Ra is an extremely prolific musician, and he's released well over 1,000 songs and tons of albums. He started in 1957 with his album Jazz by Sun Ra, and in between that and his dying day, he released hundreds of records between studio albums, singles, compilations, live recordings, rehearsal material, and even tons of posthumous releases. And he had his orchestra, which was his band, and they released music across a wide variety of different styles of jazz, including bebop, swing, big band, and even going into avant-garde experimental, which is kind of their bread and butter for the most part. And then fusion jazz, free jazz, experimentations with electronic music, and even rock and roll. And now a lot of their music is very much improv based. It can be regarded as kind of dissonant. Much of it can be kind of chaotic and abrasive. But it's through all these different variations on jazz. They covered a lot of their bases extremely well. And I'll give you a few examples of albums I would definitely recommend as far as where to kind of start and where to go. I would say that Jazz in Silhouette, which is a 1959 album, is probably one of, if not the most accessible of the Sun Ra Orchestra releases. It kind of stays mostly to like the bebop jazz, cool jazz you would expect from that time period. So it's probably his most accessible. Then you can move into like supersonic jazz from 1957, going back a little bit more. It's still pretty accessible as far as, being mostly just like straightforward jazz based, but you kind of see a little bit more of that experimentation going on there. And then you have things like the Heliocentric Worlds of Sun Ra Volumes 1 and 2 from 1965. And you have Space is the Place from 1973. And then probably his most famous and popular recording is Languidity from 1978, which deals more in kind of that fusion jazz funk. I would say if you're a fan of something like Bitches Brew by Miles Davis, then this is probably going to be up your alley. It's very much kind of groove-based, kind of cyclical and repetitive in the same way that, Bitches Brew kind of was. Now, if you want to, those are kind of his more accessible albums, I would say, to kind of start with to get a good feel for what Sun Ra is really about. But if you want to go in a more perhaps difficult and challenging direction, I would recommend maybe Cosmic Tones for Mental Therapy from 1963. That one is going to kind of throw you for a loop, but this is the list of albums I'd recommend, and I will add, of course, selections from these albums on the playlist that will accompany this episode. Now let's talk a little bit about Sun Ra's dress and stage performance. Sun Ra was well known for performing in what looked like spacesuits and ancient Egyptian garb. It was decked out with jewels, with sequins, tons of different colors and everything. You see, like on the cover of Space is the Place, he has like a headpiece that has what looks like a giant tuning fork on it. He would often be wearing kind of like a chainmail cap or like a helmet. It looked like it was made of chainmail. I don't know the exact material, but it was it was very shiny and it stood out, and he wore it often during performances. And also the members of the orchestra dressed this way as well. They all kind of matched the vibe of kind of like the spacey combination of like extraterrestrial and ancient Egyptian. They had elaborate stage sets, very theatrical performances, and something I was kind of poring over a few performances to prepare for this episode. I noticed something interesting is that even though like the saxophones and the horns and everything are made of brass, they stood out to me to kind of almost look like African gold, which might have been intentional, maybe not, but that's something I noticed, is that it looked like the instruments were made of gold when held when held by these these musicians that were decked out in this really beautiful just African garb, this like ancient Egyptian garb. Now let's get into the major section, and I'll try not to stew on this for too long. We're going to be talking about Sun Ra's philosophy, and Sun Ra's philosophy could honestly be a whole episode by itself, and we have other fish to fry on this episode. So I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as I can, but also be as comprehensive as I can. So Sun Ra believed that music could be used as a force to transport people to a different or better world. He believed that there was a planet out there where black people could be taken to live in peace and harmony, and he believed that music was one of those ways of getting there. In his film, he had an album called Space is the Place, but he also had an accompanying film as well of the same name. He delves into the concept further by saying, quote, isotopic teleportation, transmolecularization, or better still, teleport the whole planet here through music. And he's referring to the planet where black people could go and live together as a peaceful people, right? Interestingly enough, he referred to his philosophy not as a philosophy, but as an equation, because he believed that his beliefs were based on logic and pragmatism. So he called it an equation as opposed to philosophy. Now, this is interesting also because these equations were based around non-linear ways of thinking. He often spoke in non sequiturs. He would have like an absurdist manner of speech, and he often confused even his own bandmates. But even he would still inspire them, but even some of his bandmates have said that what he said to them would kind of leave them confounded for days or weeks before kind of coming around and changing their ways of thinking, or there being a whole paradigm shift of their thinking and everything. So he was really that guy, right? He fused many different disciplines as far as like modes of thinking and religions. For example, Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism. He would incorporate numerology, Freemasonry, ancient Egyptian mysticism, and also black nationalism, which is important to note because he had changing ideas on black culture. At one point, he identified with the black struggle, with the black people's struggle in America, with racism and everything, often blaming the white man for X, Y, and Z, right? And he felt that his music was pivotal for educating and empowering black people, but this way of thinking changed in the 60s as the Black Power movement was gaining traction. He felt disillusioned by the Black Power movement. He didn't feel close to any race after a while, and he felt that people of either race, black or white, were being controlled actually by some greater force. I think perhaps the best way to describe his way of thinking, his philosophy, his equations, is a quote by David Martinelli, who said, quote, Sun Ra seeks to elevate humanity beyond their current earthbound state, tied to outmoded conceptions of life and death when the potential future of immortality awaits them. This was in reference to, end quote, this was in reference to Sun Ra's equations, and I feel like, it's kind of a little bit of a oblique quote per se, but I feel that it kind of compacts Sun Ra's way of thinking, his equations, so to speak. With all that said, let's move on to our second pioneer, George Clinton. He was born July 22nd, 1941 in Kannapolis, North Carolina, but grew up in Plainsfield, New Jersey. In his teen years, he formed a doo-wop group called The Parliaments, and that would, of course, be the name of his band later on, but we'll get into that. Now, in Plainsfield, he was a partial owner of a barbershop called Silk Palace. And Silk Palace was a hangout spot for local singers and musicians, kind of like a French salon, right? And it was a major black music hub for rock and roll, for soul, and for early funk. So he was hanging around the spot, and I do believe it greatly informed his early taste for music. Now, moving on to the 60s, he was actually a staff songwriter for Motown in the 60s. Now, unfortunately, he didn't see much success commercially, but he did co-write the tune I Want to Testify, which was by his band, The Parliaments. But he would take The Parliaments and expand it to a extreme degree, as well as change its name from The Parliaments to just Parliament. And in the process, he would also found another band called Funkadelic, and it was through Parliament, and this is getting into George Clinton's music, but it was through Parliament and Funkadelic that these bands would pioneer funk in the 1970s, blending elements of James Brown and Sly Stone, two of the earliest pioneers of funk, with Jimi Hendrix and Frank Zappa, including this really heavy psychedelic funk sound. Now, as far as George Clinton's music, George Clinton himself balanced duties as a spiritual leader for both Parliament and Funkadelic, and would in time blend both bands together to create Parliament Funkadelic, also known as P-Funk for short. And members of each band would actually play in either group. So there was a lot of kind of cross-contamination of members within each band. Now, as far as Parliament was more of a straightforward funk band. They had strong percussion, strong bass lines, strong horn sections, a heavy emphasis on the downbeat, which they adopted from James Brown. When Bootsy Collins, who was the bassist for James Brown for a period of time, came over to the George Clinton side, he actually introduced George Clinton to the idea of a strong downbeat, a strong one, which you hear on songs especially like Up for the Downstroke or Everything Is on the One, which kind of personified that idea of a strong downbeat. And much of the mythology of George Clinton and P-Funk stems from Parliament, but then you have the band Funkadelic, who has a stronger assertion of psychedelic rock and acid rock influences. You'd have like extended guitar solos from guitarist Eddie Hazel, for example, like on Maggot Brain, one of the greatest guitar solos of all time. And their music and their lyrics were a lot more abstract. And I think the psychedelic nature definitely played into the abstraction of the music itself. But like I said, there was a lot of overlap between the bands, a lot of collaboration, and a lot of cross-contamination between both Parliament and Funkadelic, and of course, especially when they fused together to be Parliament Funkadelic. Now let's go over George Clinton's dress and stage performance. So Parliament Funkadelic was strongly informed by extraterrestrial technology and science fiction. I would say probably more so than Sun Ra to a degree, but you'd have things like a spaceship, like a whole spaceship on stage, which was called the mothership during performances. They would dress up as like these alien-like creatures, and you would have different kind of like really off-the-wall personalities. Like you'd have Gary Scheider, who wore a diaper, and they called him Diaper Man. You had Eddie Hazel. They give each other like different names. Like Eddie Hazel was called Maggot Brain, which of course informed the song Maggot Brain, which he did the solo on. And I would say there were probably a few less ancient Egyptian influences compared to Sun Ra. I would say that, that while both had a lot of kind of space and extraterrestrial influences and all that, George Clinton, I feel, kind of doubled down on the space influences more so than Sun Ra did, because Sun Ra kind of had a perfect balance of space elements, like science fiction elements, and like ancient Egyptian elements. Because of course, by the 70s, science fiction was a bit further along than it was in like the 50s and the 60s. So I think they were able to kind of tap into that a little bit better than Sun Ra was. But moving into George Clinton's philosophy, George Clinton, and by proxy Parliament Funkadelic, was way more overtly politically charged. Of course, Sun Ra, being a jazz musician, a lot of the music was purely instrumental, and you had vocalists, singers for Parliament Funkadelic, so a lot of their political aspects and arguments could be argued through song. You'd hear it physically, so a lot of their music was more strongly based around social commentary. And one of perhaps their biggest ideological statements was "Free your mind and your ass will follow," which of course was one of the Funkadelic albums. And this idea centered around liberation from societal and social constructs equaling happiness and freedom. You free your mind, your ass will follow, and you'll be happy. And they believed that they could achieve this through their music. Also, I think it's important to note that because of ideas and ideologies like this, that by the 1970s, they pretty much made funk into a religion. I mean, you hear on songs like P-Funk Wants to Get Funked Up, they have the line, if you got faults, defects, or shortcomings like arthritis, rheumatism, or migraines, whatever part of your body it is, I want you to lay it on your radio. Let the vibes flow through. Funk not only moves, it can remove. Dig. So they basically turned their brand of funk into a religion, and funk as a whole. A lot of the funk musicians kind of focused on this idea of funk being almost a spiritual movement, right? And then you have things like the Mothership connection. The Mothership that was a physical manifestation of liberation for Black people. They, like I said, they had the big old spaceship on the stage. That was like, come on, get on the spaceship, get out of this, get out of this muck and whatever, these stressors in your life. Come on the mothership and have a good time. Leave it all behind. It was funk as a galactic unifying force, really. And then you have things like the Chocolate City, which was a nickname for Washington, D.C., and it was immortalized on their 1975 album of the same name, Chocolate City. And it basically idealized, Washington, D.C. as this black utopia or this black Mecca, which, lasted until kind of, the decline of D.C. with, the introduction of, like, gentrification and all that. So Chocolate City was a major concept at that point in time, too. Now, I mentioned earlier the mythology of Parliament Funkadelic, and Parliament was known for having a handful of different characters and spin-off groups. You had spin-off groups like Bootsy's Rubber Band, which was made by, which was a spin-off band by the bassist Bootsy Collins. You had the Brides of Funkenstein, which was a girl group spin-off. And then you had characters like Dr. Funkenstein, who was like the creator of funk music. You had like Star Child, who was an alien visitor. and then Sir Nose Devoid of Funk, who was like an antagonist of funk. So you had kind of a story. They would combine elements of like high fantasy and like blackness and and space and extraterrestrials all into this one big thing, and they built their own ideology around around Parliament Funkadelic, around this band. So it was like the whole thing was like bigger than just the band itself. You had all these different aspects kind of fused together to make Parliament Funkadelic almost like a church, sort of, with its own sacred texts being like the music and everything, and its own characters and players, and it's just really one big thing that was bigger than just the band itself. So where does that leave us? Well, we can talk about Afrofuturism in other areas of pop music and kind of show the influence of the likes of Sun Ra and George Clinton on other musicians. You have some of Sun Ra's contemporaries like Pharoah Sanders, who Sun Ra actually sheltered early on and actually gave him the name Pharaoh. He convinced him to adopt the name Pharaoh as his actual name. And although Sun Ra has way more influences of technology and science fiction compared to Pharaoh Sanders was more focused on things like Eastern and African mysticism, much like Alice Coltrane, who bases a lot of her sound around Indian classical music and ragas, as opposed to more like science fiction and technology based themes. Then you have the likes of Prince. Now, Prince is an interesting one because while he wasn't really, decking himself out in a lot of kind of space-influenced garb or manners of dress or anything, he did have a handful of tracks that could qualify as being influenced by Afrofuturism. For example, you have the song Uptown, which talks about kind of this place where people can go and be themselves, be accepted, and then you have kind of an expansion on that idea through Paisley Park, which of course he named his compound, his home, after the song. But Paisley Park talks about this place that's in your mind where people are living in harmony and loving each other. It's this really utopian place. And then you have kind of the flip side on this kind of a bit more of a deep cut record called New World off of his album Emancipation, which is a lot more dystopian. It draws way more on electronic music influences compared to the others, but despite it being dystopian, there is an idea of like love prevailing even through kind of the proliferation of no longer having privacy, about everybody being watched all the time, just this kind of bleak future. It's like, even though the future may be bleak, we can still make it through with love. And love is often a common theme in Afrofuturism, and also, like the idea of unity, of the unity of people, and especially of Black people. So you have those aspects there. Then you have groups like Earth, Wind, and Fire, who were actually major proponents of Afrofuturism in the 1970s. But I felt they could honestly have their own section, but I felt that it was kind of redundant to talk about them and Parliament Funkadelic, because they kind of share a lot of similarities between each other, but they used music to idealize a universal love, and they also utilized a lot of ancient Egyptian imagery in stage presence and in album art, and also they utilized a lot of space age aesthetics and African mysticism in their music. Now, moving the clock a little bit forward, you have a group like Native Tongues, which was a collective of hip-hop artists in the late 80s and early 90s, which included the likes of the Jungle Brothers, De La Soul, A Tribe Called Quest, Black Sheep, Money Love, Queen Latifah, and Shia Ali. And they had close ties to the universal Zulu Nation. And what they were about was they had these Afrocentric lyrics. They had a lot of themes of unity and positivity and black identity, and they evoked a lot of African imagery through their album art, which was very different at the time because in the late 80s and early 90s, a lot of rappers were moving closer towards gangster rap, kind of the more gritty, aggressive, violent, raw sound and style and aesthetic, while these guys were moving closer to a sound that was more based around, around positivity and stuff. So that was kind of different. And they also sampled heavily from jazz and soul of the 50s and 60s. And it was through all of this that they would go on to inspire a whole host of artists, rappers that would follow in similar footsteps. And we have, just name a few, like Outkast, Roots, Kanye West, Diggable Planets, Black Star, Dead Prez. And Native Tongues, the collective, would actually kind of act as a precursor to modern Afrofuturism. They created an alternative landscape based around unity, giving rise to what we now know as alternative hip-hop, where they were basically kind of going against the grain of what popular hip-hop was moving towards, which, like I said, was more aggressive gangster rap. And, what Native Tongues were doing was radically different in comparison. Another major one is Janelle Monáe, whose a lot of her early work blended elements and concepts of science fiction and Afrofuturism. She had stories in her album centered around androids and humans living in this like dystopian society and love being suppressed. The protagonist who she played was an android, and she falls in love with her creator, which is a human, which was like a forbidden thing. And there's elements of time travel in there, so it's a lot of kind of science fiction based around love being a strong force, right? And then of course you have artists like Kamasi Washington, who is a saxophonist and band leader, and for me, Kamasi Washington pretty much picked up where Pharoah Sanders left off. He bridges cosmic spiritual jazz with like contemporary pan-African ideology. In his music, he has a lot of like celestial themes. He has these big orchestral arrangements, and it has just this really nice, grandiose feel to it. And like I said, musically, he's really kind of a direct descendant of Sun Ra and Pharoah Sanders. Now we can go on and on and on about all these different artists and musicians that have incorporated Afrofuturism into their sound and aesthetic. We can talk about Africa Bambaataa, who recently passed away, of course, Outkast, Missy Elliott, Solange Knowles, Beyonce, Rihanna, Tricky. We can talk about, FK Twigs, Flying Lotus, but we would be here forever. And, there's so many different, because of musicians like Sun Ra and George Clinton, Afrofuturism has become such a major proponent in a lot of Black popular music. And that was kind of the point of this episode, was to talk about how these two musicians both individually incorporated and pioneered Afrofuturism and how it would resound through future generations of Black popular music. So, with all that being said, I will leave you all off with that. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope you all enjoyed. Be sure to like and subscribe, like I said. There is also an accompanying playlist with songs that kind of help to contextualize the topics in this episode. Be sure to check out the socials, Instagram and TikTok. Those links will be in the description. Be sure to check out the Substack, where I publish essays and articles. The link to that will be in the description as well. And yeah, thank you all again for listening. Happy 1 year for Cultural DJ, and I will see you all next time. New episodes every Thursday. This is the Cultural DJ, signing off.